The night felt heavier than usual. Thousands of men waited in darkness, packed tightly inside steel landing craft that rocked endlessly with the waves. Engines growled beneath their feet. The air smelled of fuel, salt water, and nervous silence. No one really slept. Some American soldiers cleaned already clean rifles. Others adjusted helmets or reread letters folded inside their jackets. A few tried joking, but the laughter faded quickly. Everyone understood what morning meant. They were heading toward France, toward the biggest invasion anyone had ever attempted. For weeks, conversations had drifted through camps and ships. Quiet opinions passed between young soldiers who had never seen Europe before. The British were respected, but many Americans imagined them as careful fighters. Experienced, yes, but slower, more cautious. America had arrived late to the war. There was confidence, maybe even pride, that this new energy would change everything. No one said it out loud with arrogance. It was simply how some felt. Outside, the sea grew rougher. Cold spray slammed against the metal sides of the craft, soaking uniforms before the battle had even started. Waves rose and fell like breathing giants, lifting the boats and dropping them again. Then, suddenly, light. Far ahead, the horizon flashed. The naval bombardment began. Massive guns from battleships roared across the channel, each blast vibrating through the water. Flames burst from distant barrels, followed seconds later by rolling thunder that seemed endless. The sky filled with smoke. For a moment, it looked like the world itself was on fire. American soldiers leaned forward, trying to see through the haze. Landing craft stretched across the water in every direction, hundreds of them, moving toward separate beaches and separate missions. Some carried British troops. Through gaps in the dim, Americans could see them standing quietly, checking equipment with almost mechanical calm. No shouting, no dramatic gestures, just short nods and focused faces. One young American private noticed how composed they looked. "They don't look nervous," he muttered. Another shrugged. "Maybe they're just used to this." The closer they moved to shore, the louder everything became. Machine gun fire began snapping from the coastline. Shells burst in the water, throwing columns of spray into the air. The sea turned violent with movement. Boats swerving, engines straining, officers yelling over the chaos. Inside the craft, tension tightened. Hands gripped rifles harder. Some soldiers whispered prayers. Others stared straight ahead, breathing slowly, trying to control their fear. And then, through the smoke, something unexpected happened. American troops caught glimpses of British commandos already pushing forward near the shoreline. They moved fast, low to the ground, crossing obstacles that many assumed would stop them cold. There was no hesitation, no pause, just forward movement. A U.S. corporal leaned toward the opening, squinting through the spray. "Hold on. They're already moving up?" The moment felt surreal. Everything Americans had imagined about how the day would unfold suddenly felt uncertain. The shoreline rushed closer. Bullets snapped overhead. An officer shouted the final order. The ramp shook. Metal slammed downward. Ice-cold water surged inside the boat, and the men stepped into history. The moment their boots touched the water, everything changed. The careful planning, the maps, the briefings, all of it dissolved into noise and confusion. Cold waves crashed against the soldiers as they pushed forward, rifles held high to keep them dry. Bullets snapped across the air, cutting through smoke that rolled over the beach like fog. American troops struggled to find cover among obstacles and scattered equipment. Shouts came from every direction. Some units moved forward quickly, others froze for seconds that felt like minutes, trying to understand where the fire was coming from. Visibility was almost nothing. Smoke mixed with sand, turning the battlefield into a shifting gray world. And through that chaos, they saw movement. Along a nearby sector, British forces were already advancing inland. Not slowly, not cautiously. They moved in small groups, covering each other, rushing from obstacle to obstacle with a rhythm that looked almost practiced. Engineers cleared paths while infantry pushed ahead without waiting for everything to be perfect. One American soldier watched them through drifting smoke. "They're not stopping," he said, half surprised. What stood out wasn't aggression. It was coordination. British officers moved close to the front, shouting short, clear orders. Soldiers adapted instantly when plans changed, using terrain and wreckage as cover. It looked calm, controlled, even while chaos exploded around them. The Americans began adjusting too. Watching their allies push forward gave them momentum. Units started moving faster, using the same cover-in-advance rhythm. Soon, the beach wasn't divided into separate armies anymore. It became one massive struggle to survive and move inland. At one point, an American squad reached a damaged wall at the same time as British infantry. There was no time for introductions. Only quick nods, shared directions, a hand signal pointing toward danger. Someone passed ammunition without saying a word. The assumptions from the ships, who would lead, who would push hardest, disappeared under the reality of battle. Everyone was fighting the same war. Hours passed like minutes. The noise never stopped, and slowly, almost unnoticed, the first defensive lines began to fall behind them. The beachhead was growing, and something else was changing too, the way American soldiers saw the British. Not as cautious, not as distant allies, but as fighters who had been surviving war long before this day. By late afternoon, the sound of constant gunfire began to fade into something heavier: exhaustion. The beaches were no longer just chaos. They were filled with the signs of survival. Broken equipment lay scattered across the sand. Smoke drifted slowly inland, mixing with the sea air. Soldiers moved carefully now, no longer rushing blindly, but pushing forward with deliberate determination. American troops paused behind ruined walls and craters, catching their breath for the first time that day. And that was when they really noticed their allies. British units nearby were doing the same. Helmets dusty, uniforms soaked, faces covered in sand and sweat. No celebration, no shouting, just quiet focus. One American lieutenant watched a group of British soldiers reorganizing quickly after heavy fighting. Their movements were calm, almost routine, even after hours of combat. He shook his head, half smiling. "I didn't expect them to fight like that." It wasn't about bravery alone. It was endurance. Many of those British troops had already been fighting for years before this day. The way they moved, steady, controlled, patient, came from experience carved by long battles. American soldiers began to understand. The confidence they carried onto the beach wasn't gone, but it had changed. It had become respect. As units pushed farther inland, the lines between nationalities blurred completely. Americans shared cigarettes with British troops during brief pauses. Someone passed a canteen. Another pointed toward safer routes through the ruins. Short conversations replaced earlier assumptions. "Where are you from?" "Texas." "Manchester." Quick smiles. Then back to moving. The mission wasn't finished, but something important had happened. The invasion had forced strangers to trust each other in the worst possible conditions. As evening approached, the sky darkened, and the battlefield quieted just enough for soldiers to hear waves again hitting the shore. The cost of the day was written across tired faces, yet there was also relief. They had survived the landing, and they had learned something unexpected. Victory wouldn't come from one army alone. It would come from fighting together. As night settled over Normandy, American troops looked across the beach one last time. The British were still moving forward, steady as ever, no longer underestimated, only respected, and tomorrow they would advance together. Night did not bring peace. It only changed the way the battlefield felt. The noise of the landing had faded behind them, but now the danger was quieter, more unpredictable. Shadows stretched across hedgerows and broken roads as American and British forces moved inland together, trying to secure ground before the enemy regrouped. Exhaustion clung to everyone. Boots felt heavier. Weapons seemed to weigh more with every step. Yet no one stopped. Orders passed in low voices. Flashlights were covered with cloth to hide the light. Maps were checked again and again as officers tried to keep units aligned in the darkness. The countryside looked peaceful from a distance. Small farms, narrow lanes, stone walls. But every shadow felt dangerous. American soldiers advanced cautiously, still learning the rhythm of the terrain. Nearby, British troops moved with a kind of quiet familiarity, spreading out carefully, watching angles, signaling silently with hand gestures. One American private noticed how calm they remained even when distant gunfire echoed through the night. "They've done this before," he whispered. The answer came quickly from a sergeant beside him. "Yeah, and now we're learning fast." At times, the two forces overlapped without even realizing it. Shared checkpoints, shared cover positions, short whispered exchanges before moving again. No competition, only coordination. A sudden burst of fire cracked in the distance, forcing everyone to the ground. Seconds stretched endlessly as they waited for another shot. None came. Slowly, soldiers rose and kept moving. What surprised many Americans wasn't just how the British fought, it was how they conserved energy, how they paced themselves, staying steady instead of rushing recklessly. The adrenaline of the morning had turned into something else. Discipline. Somewhere behind them, the beaches were still crowded with reinforcements arriving by the thousands. But here, farther inland, it felt like a different war. Smaller movements, tense silence, uncertainty around every corner. As midnight approached, the combined columns paused near a shattered farmhouse. Men shared rations and water without words. One American looked around at the tired faces, British and American together, and realized something that hadn't seemed possible just hours earlier. They already trusted each other, not because of speeches, because of what they had survived side by side. The road ahead remained dark, and everyone knew the hardest fighting might still be coming. Morning returned slowly, wrapped in fog. The fields beyond the beach looked calm, green hedgerows, narrow paths, small farms untouched from a distance. But the soldiers moving through them quickly learned how dangerous this new battlefield really was. The open chaos of the beach was gone. Now every corner felt like a trap. American units advanced carefully, scanning the thick walls of brush that divided the land into tight corridors. Visibility was limited. Sound carried strangely. A branch snapping somewhere ahead could mean anything. British troops moved nearby, slower now, spreading out with deliberate caution. One American corporal noticed how they paused before crossing gaps, how they checked angles instead of rushing forward. At first, it felt almost too careful. Then, the first burst of fire echoed through the hedgerows. Everyone dropped instantly. Dust rose from the ground as bullets cut through leaves and branches. Orders were shouted in short bursts, voices controlled, but urgent. The enemy wasn't visible, only shadows and movement behind thick cover. The fighting here was different. Close. Confusing. Small decisions mattered more than speed. A British sergeant crawled toward an American squad and pointed silently toward a narrow opening in the hedgerow. Hand signals replaced words. Within seconds, both groups adjusted positions together, moving with a shared understanding formed only hours earlier. The Americans began to notice something. The British weren't just being cautious. They were reading the terrain, treating every hedge like a wall hiding danger. Slowly, the Americans adapted. Instead of charging ahead, they worked in smaller teams, covering each other, listening more than speaking. Progress came in meters, not miles. Time stretched. Minutes felt long. Sweat mixed with dirt. Hands tightened around rifles. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence felt almost louder than the battle itself. An American soldier leaned back against the earth, breathing hard. "I thought the beach was the hard part," he muttered. A British soldier beside him gave a tired half-smile. "Welcome inland." There was no mocking in it, only understanding. By midday, the combined forces began moving again, slower but smarter. The lesson had been learned. Victory here wouldn't come from speed or bravery alone. It would come from patience, from teamwork, and from trusting the men beside you, no matter the uniform. The road ahead remained uncertain, but now they moved as something new, not separate armies, a single advancing force. By the third day inland, time began to blur. The excitement of the landing was gone. Even the shock of battle had settled into something quieter, a constant state of alertness that never fully disappeared. The men moved slower now, not because they wanted to, because exhaustion had become part of them. Boots were covered in mud. Uniforms were stiff with sweat and rain. Faces looked older than they had just days before. American and British forces continued advancing through narrow roads and hedgerows, taking small pieces of ground at a time. Every farmhouse, every crossroads, every field required careful movement. The enemy was rarely seen clearly. Sometimes it was only a distant shot, sometimes nothing at all, just silence that felt wrong. During one long stretch of quiet, an American squad rested along a sunken road. Nearby, British soldiers did the same, checking maps while sharing dry rations. No one spoke much anymore. There wasn't energy for unnecessary words. One American private watched a British corporal calmly repair a damaged strap on his gear as if the war around them barely existed. It wasn't indifference. It was experience, the kind that made chaos feel almost normal. Suddenly, a burst of distant artillery rolled across the countryside. Everyone froze. Eyes scanned the horizon, but the shelling landed far away. The tension remained, hanging in the air even after the echoes disappeared. As they moved again, the road narrowed between high hedges. Visibility dropped to only a few meters ahead. Officers signaled for quiet movement, spacing out to avoid becoming an easy target. The Americans noticed how naturally the British spread out, never bunching together, always checking rear positions. Without realizing it, the Americans copied the pattern. What had started as observation had become instinct. Later that afternoon, the column passed a ruined farmhouse partially collapsed from earlier fighting. They stopped briefly to regroup. An American soldier offered a cigarette to a British sergeant. The man accepted with a small nod. No long conversation followed. None was needed. The trust between them had grown without ceremony, built through shared danger rather than words. As the sun lowered behind the fields, the battlefield grew strangely quiet. No gunfire, no explosions, just wind moving through broken branches. And for the first time since landing, some soldiers allowed themselves to breathe deeply. But everyone knew the silence wouldn't last. Somewhere ahead, new resistance was waiting, and tomorrow would demand even more. The farther they moved from the coast, the quieter the war looked, but the more dangerous it felt. The landscape changed slowly. Fields opened into wider ground. Small villages appeared ahead, their streets empty, windows broken, doors swinging in the wind. Every place looked abandoned, yet every shadow felt watched. American and British units advanced together in stretched columns, moving carefully between stone walls and narrow paths. The pace slowed again, not because of orders, because fatigue had settled deep into every movement. Some soldiers barely spoke now. Breathing and footsteps replaced conversation. The only sounds were the creak of equipment and the distant rumble of artillery somewhere beyond the horizon. At a crossroads, officers halted the column. Scouts moved forward cautiously, disappearing into the gray morning mist. Minutes passed. Too quiet. Tension grew. An American private tightened his grip on his rifle, eyes fixed ahead. Beside him, a British soldier checked his watch, calm but alert. Then, the first shot cracked through the air. Everyone dropped instantly. Gunfire erupted from hidden positions near the edge of the village. Dust exploded from walls and road signs as soldiers scrambled for cover. Orders were shouted, short, controlled, urgent. American troops pushed toward the left flank while British units moved to secure the opposite side, almost like they had rehearsed it together. But this wasn't rehearsal. It was instinct born from days fighting side by side. The exchange lasted longer than anyone expected. The enemy stayed hidden, firing quickly before disappearing again. Progress slowed to meters. Every movement required patience. At one point, an American squad became pinned behind a stone wall. Without hesitation, a nearby British section shifted position, drawing fire long enough for the Americans to reposition safely. No one talked about it afterward. It simply happened. Because that was what Allies did now. Hours later, the firing stopped as suddenly as it started. Silence returned. Heavy, exhausting, unreal. Smoke drifted between buildings while soldiers cautiously stood, checking equipment and each other. A U.S. sergeant looked toward the British soldiers who had covered them earlier. He nodded once. The British sergeant nodded back. No words. Respect didn't need them anymore. As they moved again through the quiet streets, one thought settled over many American soldiers. The biggest surprise wasn't how the British fought anymore. It was how naturally they fought together. The line had held, and it couldn't break now, not after everything they had already survived. Ahead, the road curved toward unknown ground, and the war kept moving forward. Days blurred together until no one was sure how long they had been moving inland. The excitement of the invasion had vanished completely. Now there was only routine. Advance, stop, listen, move again. American and British units marched through countryside scarred by war. The roads were narrow, lined with hedgerows that seemed endless. Sometimes civilians watched quietly from a distance. Sometimes entire villages stood empty, frozen in silence. Every step forward felt earned. Every kilometer cost energy the soldiers no longer had. Rain began falling late in the afternoon, light at first, then steady enough to soak uniforms and turn dirt roads into thick mud. Boots sank deeper with each step, slowing the column even more. Nobody complained. They simply kept moving. The two forces had learned each other's rhythms now. Americans adjusted to the deliberate pace of the British veterans, while British troops matched the Americans' drive when quick movement was needed. Without discussion, leadership shifted naturally depending on the moment. At one point, the column halted near a broken bridge. Engineers moved forward to inspect it while the rest waited in silence, scanning nearby tree lines. The pause felt dangerous. Standing still always did. An American corporal glanced at the British soldiers beside him. Their faces looked calm, tired, but steady. He realized something that surprised him. Back on the ships, he had expected to judge them. Now he watched them for reassurance. A distant explosion rolled across the hills, followed by another. Everyone stiffened, listening for signs the fighting was moving toward them. It didn't. The sound faded again. The march continued. As evening approached, fog crept low across the fields, swallowing outlines of trees and buildings. Visibility dropped. Soldiers tightened formation instinctively, not wanting to lose sight of each other. The quiet felt heavier than gunfire. No one knew what waited beyond the next bend. Only that they had to keep going. When they finally stopped for a brief rest, men sat wherever they could. Against walls, on packs, in muddy grass. Someone shared a canteen. Another offered part of a ration without asking who needed it most. The line between American and British uniforms felt almost meaningless now. They were just tired soldiers pushing toward the same objective. One American private stared into the fog and spoke quietly. "Feels like we've been walking forever." A British voice nearby answered calmly, "We keep walking until it's done." No one argued, because everyone knew it was true. Somewhere ahead, the next fight was waiting, and with each step, the weight of what they were building together grew heavier and stronger. The road ahead finally opened into higher ground. After days of marching through hedgerows and narrow lanes, the soldiers reached a ridge overlooking the countryside they had fought so hard to cross. Smoke drifted in the distance where battles still continued, but here, for a brief moment, there was quiet. Not peace, just silence between storms. American and British forces paused to regroup, spreading out along the slope. Helmets were removed. Canteens passed from hand to hand. Faces showed the same exhaustion, the kind that erased differences and left only human fatigue behind. The invasion beaches were far behind now. What had begun as uncertainty had turned into something stronger. The Americans remembered their first impressions, the assumptions made on the ships, the quiet belief that their allies might fight more cautiously. Those thoughts felt distant now. They had seen the reality. British soldiers advancing steadily through chaos, holding positions under pressure, moving with patience when rushing would have meant disaster, and just as important, trusting their American counterparts without hesitation. One U.S. sergeant watched a group of British troops setting up defensive positions nearby. He shook his head with a tired smile. "We didn't expect them to fight like that." A British soldier overheard and gave a small laugh. "Neither did we," he replied, nodding toward the Americans. "But here we are." The moment didn't feel dramatic. No cheering, no speeches, only quiet understanding. The war was far from over, and everyone knew harder fighting still waited ahead. But something had changed permanently. They were no longer separate forces meeting for the first time. They were veterans of the same battle, bound together by everything they had survived since the ramp dropped on D-Day morning. As evening light broke through the clouds, the combined units prepared to move again. Orders were passed calmly, rifles lifted, packs adjusted. No hesitation, no doubt. An American private looked down the line, British helmets beside American ones, and realized he no longer noticed the difference, only the direction they were facing. Forward, together. The column began moving once more, boots crunching softly on the road. Behind them lay the beaches where assumptions had died. Ahead lay the long road to victory, and for the men who had fought side by side, one truth remained clear. They understood each other now,